The courtroom was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. The judge, a tall, thin man with silver hair and a sneer that had been perfected over decades, leaned forward with a smirk. His name was Judge Reginald Hanover, and he had spent years looking down on people like the elderly couple standing before him. "Let me get this straight," Judge Hanover scoffed, adjusting his glasses. "You two, without a lawyer, have decided to represent yourselves in this case?" An elderly couple who probably still use flip phones and don't know the difference between a subpoena and a sandwich. The spectators in the courtroom snickered. The prosecutor, a smug man in a navy suit, folded his arms and smirked. Even the bailiff, who was supposed to be neutral, shook his head in amusement. The elderly black couple stood silently. The husband, an old man with thick glasses and a cane, simply adjusted his bow tie. His wife, a woman with silver curls pinned neatly into a bun, clasped her hands together with a small smile. Judge Hanover wasn't done. "This is a courtroom, not a church bake sale. I suggest you two stop embarrassing yourselves and accept defeat. You're going up against seasoned attorneys. You don't stand a chance." The courtroom erupted in laughter. People whispered among themselves. The old man slowly tilted his head and sighed. "Well now, Your Honor," he said softly, "that's a mighty strong opinion for someone who hasn't even let us speak yet." His wife nodded. "Indeed. But since you've decided to make this personal, we suppose it's only fair that we respond in kind." The old man took off his glasses. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek, leather-bound notebook. She flipped it open to a page covered in crisp, handwritten notes. Then, in perfect unison, they both straightened their postures and let their soft, humble expressions fade into something sharp. The courtroom shifted uneasily. Judge Hanover narrowed his eyes. "What are you playing at?" The old man smiled, but this time, there was something different about it. Something dangerous. "Oh, nothing," he said, his voice carrying a new weight. "We were just about to remind you that we are, in fact, attorneys. And not just any attorneys." His wife placed a single sheet of paper on the judge's bench. "Before you continue mocking us, Your Honor, you might want to read this." Judge Hanover snatched the paper and skimmed through it. His face drained of color. His lips parted in shock. The courtroom gasped as they saw what was written on the page. The day had started much differently for the couple. Dr. Theodore and Dr. Amelia Barrington had been enjoying a quiet breakfast in their cozy home when the mail arrived. Theodore, a retired professor of law, had taken his time sipping his coffee before opening the envelope addressed to them. The letter was from a local courthouse, informing them that they were being sued by a wealthy developer, Harold Langston. According to the document, they were being accused of violating property laws by refusing to sell their land. The Barringtons exchanged a look. "Looks like someone thinks they can bully us," Amelia said, setting down her teacup. "Thinks?" Theodore chuckled. "Oh, my dear, they have no idea who they're dealing with." The couple had spent decades working as top attorneys before quietly retiring. Theodore had specialized in corporate law, dismantling corrupt billionaires, while Amelia was a fierce civil rights attorney who had single-handedly overturned unjust cases. They had never lost a trial. They had deliberately kept a low profile in their later years, enjoying a simple life in their home. But now, it seemed the world had decided to test them again, and the Barringtons loved a challenge. A week later, they arrived at the courthouse dressed as nothing more than an elderly couple. Amelia wore her favorite floral dress and cardigan. Theodore brought his cane, not because he needed it, but because it helped complete the image of harmlessness. They had no intention of revealing who they were too soon. They wanted to see just how foolish their opponents would be. That foolishness came immediately in the form of Judge Hanover. From the moment they entered the courtroom, he had treated them with utter disdain. He cut them off when they spoke. He smirked when the opposing lawyer mocked them. And finally, he made the mistake of openly insulting them. That was his downfall. Theodore and Amelia had stayed silent long enough. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Judge Hanover continued reading the document in his hands. His fingers trembled as he read the names. Dr. Theodore Barrington, former lead counsel for the Supreme Court. Dr. Amelia Barrington, the attorney who single-handedly overturned 3 wrongful convictions and made history. Judge Hanover's mouth went dry. The prosecutor, the same one who had been so smug, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear. The elderly couple stood tall, no longer just an old man with a cane and his sweet wife. Now, they were something else, something powerful. Theodore tilted his head. "Now then, Your Honor," he said smoothly, "shall we proceed properly?" The courtroom held its breath, and Judge Hanover, for the first time in his career, had no idea what to say. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Judge Hanover's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the paper, his eyes darting between the words and the two elderly figures standing before him. The same couple he had just mocked. The same couple he had humiliated in front of the entire courtroom. And now, he realized too late, that they weren't just some clueless old folks fumbling their way through the legal system. They were legends. Theodore and Amelia Barrington stood calmly, waiting. They weren't smug, nor were they angry. They had simply shifted into their true selves, formidable attorneys who had spent their lives tearing down men exactly like Judge Hanover. The prosecutor, Charles Whitman, coughed awkwardly and shifted in his seat. The confidence he had displayed just moments ago had vanished. He had known the case would be easy. The judge was already on his side, and the plaintiffs were just some old couple. At least, that's what he had thought. Judge Hanover cleared his throat. He struggled to find the right words. "This doesn't change anything." Theodore raised a single eyebrow. "Oh." Amelia tilted her head, a small smile on her lips. "Are you quite sure about that, Your Honor?" Judge Hanover's nostrils flared. He was trapped, and he knew it. If he backed down now, it would look as though he had been intentionally biased. But if he continued to mock them, he risked humiliating himself even further. Before he could respond, the doors to the courtroom burst open. A man in an expensive suit stormed inside. Harold Langston, the wealthy real estate developer who had filed the lawsuit, had finally arrived. His face was red with frustration, his briefcase swinging wildly as he marched toward the prosecution's table. "What the hell is taking so long?" Langston barked. "This should have been over in minutes. They're just a couple of old." He stopped mid-sentence when his eyes fell on the Barringtons. Theodore gave him a slow nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. Langston." Langston frowned. Something about the way the old man spoke unsettled him. There was a confidence in his tone, an assurance that suggested he knew something Langston didn't. Whitman, the prosecutor, cleared his throat. "Mr. Langston, there's been a development." Langston scowled. "I don't care about developments. I hired you to win this case. These two are." He trailed off as Amelia slid another document across the table. "You may want to read this before making any more assumptions." Langston snatched the paper and scanned it quickly. His face turned pale. His eyes darted up to the judge, then back to the paper. This is a joke, right?" he whispered. Judge Hanover remained silent. Langston's mouth went dry. The paper detailed the full history of Theodore and Amelia Barrington's careers. It listed every major case they had won, every corporation they had dismantled, every corrupt judge they had taken down, including judges exactly like Reginald Hanover. Langston's hand trembled as he set the paper down. He suddenly felt hot, as though the walls were closing in on him. "No," he muttered to himself. "This can't be happening." Amelia watched him closely. "I believe the phrase you're looking for is, 'I've made a terrible mistake.'" The spectators in the courtroom were no longer laughing. Some whispered among themselves. Others stole nervous glances at the judge, wondering what would happen next. Judge Hanover finally found his voice. He slammed his gavel down, harder than necessary. "That's enough. This is my courtroom, and I will not have it turned into a circus." Theodore sighed, adjusting his bow tie. "Your courtroom, is it?" Amelia placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, dear." She turned to Judge Hanover and smiled. "You seem flustered, Your Honor. Almost as though you're realizing the consequences of your words." Hanover's face darkened. I am perfectly aware of the law, Mrs. Barrington." "Dr. Barrington," she corrected smoothly. "And forgive me, but you don't seem perfectly aware of anything at all." A small gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hanover clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. especially not by people he had just dismissed as nobodies. I suggest, he said through gritted teeth, that we proceed with the case. Theodore and Amelia exchanged a look. Then Theodore chuckled. Proceed, indeed. Amelia nodded. Yes. Let's see how this plays out, shall we? They stepped back to their table, their calm demeanor completely unchanged. The case had only just begun, and yet it was already clear. The Barringtons were not the ones who should be afraid. The tension in the courtroom was thick, heavy like a storm about to break. Judge Hanover adjusted his robes, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. His face was a deep shade of red, though whether from anger or embarrassment, no one could say for sure. The prosecutor, Charles Whitman, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Harold Langston sat rigid, his jaw clenched, eyes darting back and forth between the judge and the Barringtons, as if looking for an escape route. Theodore Barrington folded his hands neatly on the defense table. Very well then, Your Honor, he said smoothly. Let's proceed. We wouldn't want to waste anyone's time. Amelia gave her husband a small smile before turning her attention to the opposing counsel. Mr. Whitman, would you like to begin? Whitman cleared his throat. Ahem. Yes. Yes, of course. He hesitated for a moment, gathering his composure. Then, he straightened his tie and stood up. He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice regaining some of its previous confidence. At its core, this case is simple. The plaintiffs, Harold Langston and his development company, have been trying to purchase the land owned by the defendants, Mr. and Mrs. Barrington. However, rather than engage in reasonable negotiations, the defendants have repeatedly obstructed progress, refusing to vacate the property despite multiple legal notices. He paused, glancing toward the couple, expecting some sort of reaction. He got none. Emboldened, he continued. The plaintiffs have done everything by the book. They've followed all the proper channels. And yet, the defendants refuse to cooperate. In the end, this is not just about one piece of land. It is about the law. He turned dramatically toward the judge. And the law must be upheld. Judge Hanover nodded approvingly. Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Now, Dr. Barrington. He turned toward Theodore with a smirk. Since you're so eager to represent yourselves, perhaps you'd like to offer your rebuttal? Theodore adjusted his glasses. Oh, I'd be delighted. He rose from his chair at a leisurely pace, his cane tapping softly against the floor. He turned toward the jury, offering them a polite nod before clasping his hands behind his back. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice rich and steady. Mr. Whitman here claims that this case is simple, and I do agree, but perhaps not in the way he thinks. There were a few quiet chuckles from the spectators. Theodore took a step forward. You see, my wife and I did not refuse to negotiate with Mr. Langston. In fact, we engaged with his company multiple times over the course of the last year. And each time, we made it clear that we were not interested in selling our property. He turned toward Langston and raised an eyebrow. And yet, despite our very clear refusals, Mr. Langston decided to persist. Langston scoffed, folding his arms. Theodore continued. Now, the law states that if a person does not wish to sell their land, they do not have to. He paused, glancing toward the jury. I assume you all knew that? A few jurors exchanged glances and nodded. Theodore turned back to Judge Hanover. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit A into evidence. Amelia, without missing a beat, pulled a neatly organized folder from her bag and walked it over to the bailiff. The bailiff handed it to the judge, who frowned as he flipped through the pages. What is this? Hanover asked, irritated. Theodore smiled. Oh, just a little light reading for you. What you're looking at, Your Honor, is every single legal violation Mr. Langston's company has committed in their attempts to take our land. Judge Hanover's expression darkened. Theodore continued. Harassment, fraudulent documents, illegal zoning adjustments, and, oh, this one's my personal favorite, an attempted use of eminent domain, even though the law explicitly does not apply to private development projects such as his. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Langston's face twisted with rage. This is nonsense, he barked. We followed every procedure. That paperwork doesn't mean anything. Amelia, who had remained seated, calmly flipped through another folder. Oh dear, she mused. I do believe it does mean something. She pulled out another sheet of paper and held it up. Langston's eyes widened in horror. Theodore smirked. Recognize this, Mr. Langston? The courtroom fell dead silent as Langston's face turned ghostly white. Then Theodore turned toward the judge. This, Your Honor, is an email from Mr. Langston's own legal team. In it, they discuss ways to manipulate the local zoning laws to force us out of our home. By illegal means, Judge Hanover's face paled. The prosecutor, Whitman, sank into his seat, sweat forming at his brow. The jury exchanged shocked glances. The courtroom was unraveling, and Theodore knew it. He slowly walked back to his seat and sat down. So, Your Honor, he said casually, before we continue, I'd like to ask, who exactly is obstructing the law? Langston slammed his fists on the table. This is ridiculous. You can't. Watch yourself, Mr. Langston, Amelia said coolly. Her voice, though soft, sliced through the room like a blade. Langston froze. Judge Hanover's hands were shaking. He glanced toward the bailiff, toward the jury, toward the spectators. Everyone was watching him. He had lost control. He had to do something. He clenched his jaw, gripping his gavel. That's enough, he snapped, striking the bench so hard that the sound rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. Theodore leaned back in his chair, utterly unbothered. Judge Hanover took a deep breath, his nostrils flaring. I will review this evidence, he said sharply. Court is adjourned until further notice. He slammed his gavel again and stood, storming out of the courtroom before anyone could stop him. The silence that followed was deafening. Whitman, now visibly shaken, hurried to pack up his notes. Langston, on the other hand, looked like he had swallowed a lemon whole. The spectators began whispering. Amelia calmly gathered her documents and placed them neatly into her bag. Theodore glanced at her with a small smile. Well, he mused, that was entertaining. Amelia chuckled. Oh, darling, it's only just begun. And as they stood to leave, Harold Langston shot them a glare so venomous, it could have burned through steel. But the Barringtons simply walked past him. They had already won the first battle, and the war was just beginning. The courthouse hallways buzzed with whispers as Theodore and Amelia Barrington strolled through them, their steps measured, their expressions calm. The same people who had laughed at them earlier now stole glances filled with curiosity, and, in some cases, fear. Judge Hanover had stormed out. The prosecutor had been shaken. Harold Langston had been exposed. And yet, something told Amelia that this case was far from over. As they reached the courthouse exit, a voice called out behind them. Dr. Barrington. Dr. Barrington. They turned. It was Charles Whitman, the prosecutor. He had broken into a light jog to catch up with them, his forehead glistening with sweat. I need to speak with you, he panted, adjusting his tie. Theodore arched an eyebrow. About what, exactly? Whitman swallowed hard. I didn't know about the zoning fraud. Amelia tilted her head. Didn't you? He hesitated, rubbing his palms together. Look, I took this case because I thought it was open and shut. But Langston never told me he was tampering with local laws. Theodore crossed his arms, watching him carefully. And now that you do know? Whitman exhaled sharply. I want out. The couple exchanged a glance. Interesting, Amelia murmured. And why exactly should we believe you? Because, Whitman said desperately, Langston is dangerous. He glanced around nervously, lowering his voice. You don't know what he's capable of. If you think he's going to roll over just because you embarrassed him today, you're mistaken. He doesn't lose. Theodore chuckled, his eyes twinkling. Neither do we. Whitman frowned. You don't understand. He doesn't play fair. And if I keep representing him, I could get caught in the crossfire. Amelia studied him for a moment, then sighed. So, what do you want from us, Mr. Whitman? Whitman hesitated. I can withdraw from the case. If you push hard enough, I can file a motion to step down as the prosecutor. Theodore smiled. How very noble of you. But tell me, are you doing this out of integrity or fear? Whitman licked his lips. Does it matter? Theodore thought for a moment, then shook his head. No, I suppose it doesn't. Amelia reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, handing it to him. You have 24 hours to file that motion. If you fail to do so, we'll assume you've chosen your side. Whitman looked at the card as if it were his last lifeline. Then he nodded, turned, and hurried away down the hallway. Theodore watched him disappear, then exhaled. He's telling the truth. Langston's not finished. Amelia nodded. Then we should prepare. As they stepped outside, a cold breeze greeted them, but it wasn't the wind that sent a shiver down Amelia's spine. It was a feeling, a deep, instinctual warning. Langston was angry, and desperate men did dangerous things. Later that evening, the Barringtons sat in their cozy living room, surrounded by bookshelves filled with old legal tomes, framed awards, and relics from their courtroom battles over the decades. Amelia sat on the couch, flipping through a thick legal binder, while Theodore stood by the window, watching the darkened street outside their home. Something wasn't sitting right. Do you hear that? He murmured. Amelia glanced up. Hear what? He frowned. Exactly. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, the distant chatter of children playing, the rustle of leaves, the occasional passing car, were absent. The street was too quiet. Amelia set her binder aside and stood. Do you think we're being watched? Theodore's grip tightened on his cane. I know we are. Just then, the porch light flickered. A shadow moved outside. Theodore exchanged a look with Amelia before stepping toward the front door. He unlocked it, opened it slightly, and froze. A single envelope lay on their welcome mat, pristine white with no postage stamp. Someone had delivered it by hand. Theodore bent down and picked it up, his fingers carefully peeling it open. Inside was a single piece of paper. Written in bold, red ink were the words, "Drop the case or else." Amelia's eyes darkened. How unoriginal, Theodore sighed, setting the note down on the coffee table. They must think we scare easily. Amelia chuckled. Should we tell them they're mistaken? Before Theodore could answer, a sudden crash shattered the quiet. A rock had been thrown through their living room window, glass splintering across the floor. And tied around the rock was another note. Theodore picked it up, unfurled it, and read the new message aloud. Last warning. The couple stood in silence for a moment. Then Amelia calmly stepped over the glass, picked up her phone, and dialed. Hello, police? Yes, I'd like to report an incident. Oh no, we're quite fine. Just an amateur attempt at intimidation. She smirked. They'll have to try harder than that. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers flashed against the Barringtons' home, illuminating the broken glass scattered across the living room floor. Officers combed through the area, taking notes, snapping photos, and muttering to each other. One officer, a burly man with graying hair, stood with his hands on his hips, looking unimpressed. His name tag read Sergeant Miller. So, let me get this straight, Miller said, scratching his chin. Somebody throws a rock through your window, leaves a couple of threats, and you're just standing here like it's a minor inconvenience? Amelia, sitting comfortably in her armchair, sipped her tea. Because it is a minor inconvenience, Sergeant. Theodore, leaning against his cane, nodded. If whoever did this was serious, we'd be dealing with more than a broken window. Miller narrowed his eyes. With all due respect, Dr. Barrington, most folks would be rattled after something like this. Amelia raised an eyebrow. Most folks don't have our experience. The sergeant sighed, flipping through his notepad. You got any suspects? Theodore smirked. Oh, we have a very good guess. Miller glanced up. Langston? Amelia nodded. It's his style. Cowardly, indirect, and legally ambiguous. Miller exhaled through his nose. Well, I can put in a report, maybe run some security footage from nearby homes, but I'll be honest with you. Without a witness or hard evidence, this isn't going to go far. Theodore chuckled. That's all right, Sergeant. We don't need the law to catch Langston. Miller frowned. You are the law. Amelia smiled. Exactly. The sergeant studied them for a moment before shaking his head. You two are something else. Theodore gave him a slow nod. We try. Miller scribbled a few more notes before closing his notepad. All right. We'll patrol the area tonight. But if this escalates, you call us. We will, Amelia said pleasantly. Miller didn't look convinced. He gave them a lingering glance before motioning for his officers to wrap things up. As the last patrol car drove away, Theodore locked the door behind them. He turned to Amelia, his expression thoughtful. They're scared, he murmured. She nodded. Which means they're going to act recklessly. Theodore exhaled. Good. That makes them easier to trap. The next morning, Harold Langston stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. His assistant, a nervous young man named Greg, flinched. "Gee, get me Whitman," Langston barked, throwing his briefcase onto his desk. Greg hesitated. Sir, about that. I don't want excuses, I want results." Langston snapped. Greg swallowed. "That's the thing, sir. Whitman, he withdrew from the case." Langston froze. "What?" Greg nodded quickly. "He filed the motion early this morning. Judge Hanover approved it. We don't have a prosecutor anymore." Langston's eye twitched. "That little weasel." "There's more," Greg said cautiously. Langston rounded on him. "More." Greg held up his phone, tapping the screen nervously. The media picked up on it. There's already an article circulating about the case. Apparently, the Barringtons have a pretty big reputation in the legal world. Langston snatched the phone from Greg's hand and read the headline. "Billionaire developer faces legal titans in high-stakes court battle." His grip tightened. The article detailed the Barringtons' background, their victories, their undefeated record. The comments were filled with people mocking him, calling him a coward. Langston clenched his fists. He had underestimated them, but that mistake wouldn't happen again. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. Then, he turned to Greg. "Find me another prosecutor. One with no scruples. Someone who will win, no matter what." Greg hesitated. "Sir, that might take some time." Langston grabbed his assistant by the collar, pulling him close. "I don't have time. Get it done." Greg gulped and nodded furiously. Langston shoved him back. "And send a message to Judge Hanover. I want a private meeting." Greg hesitated. "Is that legal?" Langston smirked. "It won't be on record." Later that night, Theodore sat in his study, flipping through an old case file. Amelia sat across from him, reading quietly. A notification buzzed on their phone. Amelia glanced at it. "Oh dear. Langston's trying to meet with Judge Hanover in secret." Theodore sighed. "Predictable." She smirked. "Shall we crash their little gathering?" Theodore chuckled. "I thought you'd never asked." They grabbed their coats, stepping into the night. It was time to turn the tables. The Barringtons moved like shadows through the night, their steps silent, their purpose clear. They had spent years mastering the art of gathering information, of uncovering hidden meetings, exposing corruption, and outmaneuvering the powerful. And tonight would be no different. Judge Hanover's secret meeting with Harold Langston was set to take place at an upscale, private lounge known as the Monarch Club, a dimly lit, exclusive spot where only the wealthiest and most connected dared to gather. Theodore and Amelia had been there before, many years ago, during another high-stakes case. They knew the layout. They knew the staff. And most importantly, they knew how to get in undetected. As they approached the club's entrance, a large, broad-shouldered bouncer blocked their path. "Members only." Theodore adjusted his bow tie and smiled. "Oh, I believe our names are on the list." The bouncer squinted at them, clearly doubtful. "And who exactly are you?" Amelia reached into her purse and pulled out a small, black card with gold lettering. The bouncer's eyes widened. It was an old membership card, one that hadn't been used in years but still held weight in places like this. The bouncer frowned, clearly unsure what to do. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he stepped aside. "Welcome back to the Monarch Club." The Barringtons nodded politely and stepped inside. Inside, the club was a blend of dark wood, gold accents, and quiet jazz music floating through the air. Plush velvet booths lined the walls, and crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the polished marble floors. It was the kind of place where powerful men whispered about things they didn't want the world to know. Theodore and Amelia moved with ease, their presence unnoticed as they weaved through the club. They spotted him almost instantly, Judge Hanover, sitting in a dimly lit corner booth, sipping a glass of expensive scotch, and across from him sat Harold Langston. Langston was leaning forward, speaking in low, aggressive tones. Judge Hanover, for his part, looked nervous, glancing around the room as if he knew he was doing something he shouldn't. Amelia tapped Theodore's arm. "Let's get closer." The couple slid into a nearby booth, close enough to hear but far enough to remain unnoticed. Amelia casually placed her purse on the table, angling it so the small, discreet recorder inside could capture every word. Langston's voice was sharp, edged with frustration. "You're losing control of the case, Hanover." The judge stiffened. "I am handling it." Langston scoffed. "No, you're not. Those two relics just made you look like a fool in your own courtroom." Judge Hanover clenched his jaw. "What do you want from me?" Langston leaned in. "I want you to make sure this case doesn't go to trial." The judge hesitated. "That's difficult." Langston smirked. "Not if you play it right. Dismiss the case on a technicality. Say they failed to file something correctly. Make it look legal." Judge Hanover's hands tightened around his glass. "You're asking me to commit judicial misconduct." Langston chuckled. "I'm reminding you who put you on that bench in the first place." Silence. Theodore and Amelia exchanged a glance. Judge Hanover exhaled sharply. "I can't just—" Langston cut him off. "Figure it out. Because if you don't, I'll make sure you never sit on that bench again." Judge Hanover paled. Langston stood, adjusting his expensive suit. "Do your job, Hanover, and make sure those two don't win." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing through the back exit. Judge Hanover sat there for a long moment, gripping his glass as if it were the only thing keeping him steady. Then, slowly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. Amelia and Theodore watched as he typed out a message. A moment later, their own phone buzzed. Amelia glanced at it and smirked. "Court session rescheduled," she murmured. "Looks like he's making his move." Theodore smiled. "Then we should make ours." The next morning, they were ready. The Barringtons arrived at the courthouse early, dressed as impeccably as ever. The moment they stepped inside, they could feel the tension. Judge Hanover was already seated at the bench, avoiding eye contact. Harold Langston sat beside his new attorney, a slick, arrogant man in a designer suit who practically oozed corruption. And then there was the courtroom itself. The spectators, the legal aides, even the clerks, everyone had heard about the previous hearing. And now, they were watching closely, waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Hanover cleared his throat. "We have a motion to dismiss the case," he announced, barely looking up, "on the grounds that the defendants failed to properly submit." "I object." Theodore's voice rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. Judge Hanover flinched. Theodore smiled. "Before you continue, Your Honor, I have something that might interest the court." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small flash drive. Judge Hanover's face went white. Amelia handed the drive to the bailiff. "On this drive," she said pleasantly, "is a recording of a rather fascinating conversation that took place last night at the Monarch Club." Langston sat up straight. "You." "Sure," Amelia said, placing a finger to her lips. "Let's not ruin the surprise." The bailiff inserted the drive into the courtroom computer. And then, Langston's voice filled the room. "Dismiss the case on a technicality. Say they failed to file something correctly. Make it look legal." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hanover's hands shook. Langston looked ready to explode. Theodore leaned forward. "Your Honor, I believe this makes it very clear that Mr. Langston has attempted to tamper with the court." Amelia smiled sweetly. "Now, what was that about dismissing our case?" Judge Hanover swallowed hard. He looked around, realizing that everyone had heard it. The clerks, the jury members, the legal aides. If he sided with Langston now, it would be career suicide. With a shaking hand, he picked up his gavel. "Motion to dismiss. Denied." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Langston shot to his feet. "You coward. You think you can." "The next person who speaks out of turn," Judge Hanover snapped, his face burning with humiliation, "will be held in contempt." Langston's jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with fury. The Barringtons remained calm, their work done for the day. The war wasn't over. But this battle? This battle was theirs. The courtroom was still ringing with the weight of Judge Hanover's reluctant ruling. Theodore and Amelia Barrington sat serenely at their table, but beneath their composed exteriors, they knew the tides had shifted. Harold Langston's face was twisted in fury, his fingers digging into the wooden edge of the prosecutor's table. His new attorney, a smug, shark-like man named Victor Prescott, leaned toward him and whispered something in his ear. Langston took a deep breath, forcing a smirk onto his lips as he leaned back in his chair. His anger hadn't faded. It had simply been contained, like a venomous snake coiling for its next strike. Judge Hanover cleared his throat, still visibly rattled by the exposure of his secret meeting. "This court will reconvene in 2 days," he announced, his voice uneven. "We will proceed with the case as scheduled." He slammed his gavel down and bolted from the bench before anyone could say another word. The courtroom burst into a flurry of whispers. Amelia calmly gathered her papers. "That was satisfying," she murmured. Theodore nodded. "But it's not over." They both knew that Langston wouldn't simply accept defeat. He had power, resources, and a dangerous willingness to break the law to get what he wanted. And now, he was out for blood. As they stood to leave, a voice stopped them. "You think you've won?" Langston's sneering voice cut through the noise. The Barringtons turned. Langston took slow, deliberate steps toward them, his lips curled in an eerie smile. "You embarrassed me in court today," he said, his voice deceptively light. "That was a mistake." Theodore adjusted his glasses. "Was it?" Langston chuckled, shaking his head. "You think because you caught one little conversation that you've beaten me? You think the law is going to stop me?" Amelia smirked. "It usually does." Langston leaned in slightly. "Not this time." Theodore tilted his head. That almost sounds like a threat, Mr. Langston." Langston grinned. "Oh, it is." Before the bailiff could intervene, Langston turned on his heel and strode toward the exit, his attorney trailing behind him. Amelia watched him go. "He's desperate." Theodore nodded. "And that makes him dangerous." That night, the Barringtons were extra cautious. They had been in this position before, when a powerful man with too much money and too little patience felt trapped. And they knew that Langston wasn't finished with them yet. Theodore sat at his desk, flipping through their case files, while Amelia went over security footage on her laptop. Then, just past midnight, their home phone rang. Theodore frowned. Strange. No one calls the house phone. Amelia muted her laptop. "Be careful." Theodore picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Silence. Then, a slow, distorted voice. "I warned you." The line went dead. Theodore slowly set the phone down. Amelia narrowed her eyes. "That was him." Theodore nodded. "He's losing control." Just then, a loud thump came from outside. Amelia was on her feet instantly, moving to the window. She peered through the curtains, her sharp eyes scanning the front yard. Nothing. But then, Theodore's cane tapped softly against the floor as he joined her. His gaze settled on the porch. There, sitting in the center of their welcome mat, was a small black box. Neither of them moved. The last time they had received an unmarked package, it had contained evidence of a corrupt governor's crimes. This time, however, they suspected it was something far more sinister. Amelia grabbed her phone and dialed Sergeant Miller. "We have a situation." 15 minutes later, police cars once again surrounded the Barringtons' home. Sergeant Miller crouched on the porch, studying the black box with a cautious expression. 2 officers stood nearby, waiting for instructions. Miller sighed. "I hate this kind of stuff." One of the officers nodded. "Want us to call in the bomb squad?" Amelia raised an eyebrow. "Do you really think Harold Langston is bold enough to use explosives?" Miller shot her a look. "I don't assume anything when it comes to powerful men with grudges." Theodore tapped his cane thoughtfully. "Open it." Miller frowned. "Are you sure?" Theodore nodded. With a wary expression, Miller carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a single item, a photograph. Miller picked it up and turned it over. The moment he saw it, his face hardened. He handed it to Amelia. She took one look and felt her stomach twist. The photograph showed her and Theodore, taken that very morning, outside the courthouse. The message scrawled across the image in red ink read, "You're being watched." Silence fell over the group. Sergeant Miller exhaled slowly. "All right," he muttered, rubbing his forehead. "Now it's personal." Theodore took the photograph, holding it between his fingers. Amelia looked at her husband. "He wants us to be scared." Theodore smirked. "Then we'll disappoint him." Miller's expression turned grim. "You two need protection." Theodore shook his head. "What we need is a counterattack." Amelia folded her arms. "Langston thinks he's untouchable. Let's show him he isn't." Miller sighed. "I really don't like where this is going." Theodore smiled. "Then you may want to look away." They had played defense long enough. It was time to go on the offensive. The morning after the late-night threat, the Barringtons were already in motion. They had spent decades dismantling corrupt corporations, exposing fraudulent officials, and outwitting the most dangerous players in the legal game. Harold Langston thought he was untouchable. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Theodore sat at his desk, his fingers skimming over old case files, looking for patterns. Amelia, perched elegantly on the couch, had her laptop open, sifting through property records, business transactions, and court filings connected to Langston's company. Then she found it. She turned the laptop toward Theodore. "Darling, I think I have something." He leaned in. There, listed in plain sight, was a series of land acquisitions under Langston's name. But one caught Amelia's attention. A housing project approved in half the normal time, by none other than Judge Reginald Hanover. Theodore's lips curled into a slow smile. "Oh, Hanover. You just made this so much easier." Langston had clearly been bribing Hanover long before their case. And now, they had proof. Amelia closed the laptop. "Let's put him in a position he can't escape." That afternoon, Theodore made a call. "Hello, this is Dr. Barrington," he said smoothly. "I'd like to schedule a press conference." That evening, a dozen reporters gathered outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, microphones raised. The legal community had already been buzzing about the case, and the recent threats against the Barringtons had only fueled public interest. At precisely 6 p.m., Theodore and Amelia stepped forward. Amelia spoke first. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm but firm. "My husband and I have dedicated our lives to upholding justice. Unfortunately, it seems there are those who believe they are above the law." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Theodore continued. "Harold Langston and his associates have not only attempted to intimidate us, but have been engaging in illegal dealings behind the scenes." Gasps. The reporters leaned in, hanging on to every word. Theodore held up a folder. "Inside this file, we have evidence linking Langston to fraudulent land purchases, approved by Judge Reginald Hanover himself." The flash of cameras intensified. Amelia took over. "This corruption will no longer go unchallenged. We will be filing a formal judicial complaint against Judge Hanover first thing in the morning." The reporters exploded with questions. "Are you saying the judge has been bribed? What actions will be taken against Langston? Have you received more threats?" Amelia gave a small, knowing smile. "If Mr. Langston wishes to continue his games, we are more than happy to play." The press conference ended with a storm of excitement. The Barringtons had just declared war on Langston in the most public way possible. Inside a dimly lit office, Harold Langston watched the press conference from his desk. His hands clenched into fists. Victor Prescott, his attorney, turned to him. "They're humiliating you." Langston's jaw tightened. "I don't care about humiliation," he hissed. "I care about winning." Prescott folded his arms. "With that evidence, Hanover's finished." Langston exhaled sharply. "Then we need to move fast." His eyes darkened. "I want the Barringtons gone." "Make the call." Prescott hesitated. "Harold." "Now." Prescott sighed and pulled out his phone. That night, Theodore and Amelia sat in their study, going over the day's events. They had played their hand, and it had worked. The media was eating it up, and Langston was on the defensive. But something still felt off. Amelia closed her book. "You feel it, too." Theodore nodded. Langston isn't the type to sit back and take a loss. As if on cue, their phone rang. Theodore picked it up. "Dr. Barrington speaking." A deep, Unfamiliar voice rumbled on the other end. You were warned. Click. The line went dead. Theodore exhaled, rubbing his temples. Then bang. A gunshot rang out. The sound shattered the quiet night. Amelia bolted to her feet. Theodore. The two rushed to the window. A dark figure stood at the edge of their property, a gun raised, aimed directly at them. Another shot fired. The glass shattered, raining down into the living room. Theodore grabbed Amelia and pulled her down behind the couch. More gunshots. Wood splintered. Books toppled from shelves. Then, silence. They stayed crouched, listening. Footsteps. Faint. Then disappearing into the night. Amelia exhaled sharply. He's escalating. Theodore's face was set in stone. Then we escalate too. They had been playing defense long enough. Now, it was time to end this. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. Glass crunched under Theodore's shoes as he carefully stepped around the shattered window. Outside, the night was eerily still. Whoever had fired the shots had vanished into the darkness, but one thing was clear. Harold Langston had stopped playing games. Amelia, still crouched behind the couch, exhaled slowly, her pulse steady despite the near miss. "Darling," she murmured, adjusting her blouse as she stood. "I believe our opponent just made a grave mistake." Theodore smirked. "Indeed." A sharp knock echoed from the front door. They exchanged a glance before Theodore walked over, stepping cautiously. He peered through the peephole before opening the door. Sergeant Miller stood there, his face set in a grim expression, a group of officers behind him. "Tell me," Miller said, stepping inside, "do you ever have a peaceful night?" Theodore chuckled. "Not lately." Miller's eyes scanned the damage, the bullet-riddled walls, the broken glass. "I take it this wasn't just some random break-in?" Amelia crossed her arms. "No, it was a message." Miller sighed. "I don't suppose you have any security footage?" Amelia gestured toward the corner of the room, where a small but high-tech security camera was mounted. "We always come prepared." Miller nodded to his officers. "Get that footage. I want a full analysis." One of the officers carefully retrieved the security drive, while another started taking photos of the damage. Miller turned back to the couple. "You realize what's happening here, don't you?" Theodore adjusted his glasses. "Langston is getting desperate." Miller shook his head. "More than desperate. He's backed into a corner, and that makes him the most dangerous type of man." Amelia tapped her fingers against her arm. "So what's your plan, Sergeant?" Miller ran a hand down his face. "I want you two out of this house. At least until we know who's behind this." Theodore smiled. "Oh, we already know." Miller frowned. "You think you know. But we need to prove it before we can arrest anyone." Amelia tilted her head. "You misunderstand, Sergeant. We don't need proof. We just need leverage." Miller groaned. "I don't like the sound of that." Theodore clapped him on the shoulder. "Then you may want to leave the room." An hour later, the security footage was analyzed. The video showed a masked man creeping onto the Barringtons' property, raising his weapon, and firing before disappearing into a black SUV. But one crucial detail stood out. As the shooter fled, the camera caught the license plate. Miller leaned in, reading the digits. His eyes widened. "Well, I'll be damned." Amelia smirked. "Do share, Sergeant." Miller exhaled sharply. "That SUV is registered to Langston's company." The room went silent. Miller turned to his officers. "Get me an arrest warrant. Now." Meanwhile, across town, Harold Langston sat in his penthouse office, sipping an expensive whiskey, his fingers drumming against the desk. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the caller ID before answering. "Is it done?" A pause. Then, a voice on the other end. "There's a problem." Langston's grip tightened. "What kind of problem?" "They got the plate. Cops are moving on you." Langston's face darkened. He slammed his glass down so hard it nearly shattered. Victor Prescott, his attorney, raised an eyebrow from the corner of the office. "Bad news?" Langston shot him a glare. "Shut up." He turned back to the phone. "Listen to me. Fix this." "I don't care how." The line went dead. Langston exhaled through clenched teeth. The Barringtons had won the legal battle. He had tried to scare them, and now He was the one being hunted, but he wasn't going down alone. Prescott, he snapped. The attorney leaned forward. Yes? Langston's eyes gleamed with something dark. We're burning it all down. Back at the Barringtons' home, Miller's phone rang. He stepped away to take the call, his expression shifting from satisfaction to concern in seconds. He turned back to Theodore and Amelia. We have a problem. Theodore adjusted his cane. Another one? Miller's jaw tightened. Langston is making moves. Big ones. We just got word that he's shifting all his assets, scrubbing records, covering his tracks. Amelia raised an eyebrow. In other words, he's preparing to run. Miller nodded. And if he does, he'll disappear. No trial. No justice. Theodore's gaze sharpened. Then we don't let him run. Amelia smiled. I do believe it's time for checkmate. Miller sighed. All right. What's the plan? Theodore smirked. Oh, it's simple. He turned to Amelia. Darling, shall we set a trap? Amelia chuckled. Oh, let's. They had baited men like Langston before. Now, it was time to finish him. The plan was set. The Barringtons had played the game long enough. Now, it was time to make sure Harold Langston couldn't escape. Theodore and Amelia had spent hours strategizing, connecting the dots and plotting each move with precision. They knew Langston was a man driven by power, arrogance, and greed, and those weaknesses would be his undoing. We'll hit him where it hurts most, Theodore said, pacing in the study. His wealth. Amelia leaned against the wall, arms folded. The people Langston trusts most are the ones he's already betrayed. We've seen it in the way he operates. He'll throw anyone under the bus if it means saving himself. Theodore nodded. Exactly. We'll leak the information he least expects. We'll make sure the press is all over his secret holdings, his illegal land deals, his ties to Hanover. We'll shine a light so bright that not even Langston can hide. Then, we have to make him think we've failed, Amelia added. Make him think he's won. He'll want to move quickly. We can use that desperation to trap him. She turned to her husband, a glint of determination in her eyes. You're right. He'll run if he thinks he can get away. He always does. And when he tries, we'll be ready. The next morning, the Barringtons leaked a series of carefully curated files to the press. They'd embedded Langston's private documents, the evidence of his illegal land dealings, and Hanover's involvement. The files were marked with a timestamp, showing the depth of Langston's corruption, the under-the-table agreements, and the millions he had funneled through shell companies. By the time the news hit the airwaves, the fallout was immediate. Langston's world unraveled in a matter of hours. News outlets had exploded with stories about his shady dealings, his crooked connections, and his ties to a judge who had been compromised by money. The calls for his arrest came fast and furious. In a panic, Langston immediately tried to move his assets, covering his tracks in every way possible. His attorney, Prescott, worked frantically to block the media from getting even more access to Langston's financial records. But it was too late. The story had already gone viral. Amelia and Theodore watched as Langston's empire began to crumble before his eyes. They didn't waste a single second, and soon, every financial institution that Langston had worked with was distancing itself from him. Bank accounts were frozen. His properties were seized. He was boxed in. Langston is about to make his move, Theodore said, his voice calm but filled with anticipation. Let's make sure we're in position. Amelia nodded. He'll run. They always do. Langston wasn't foolish enough to wait for the authorities to knock on his door. With the walls closing in around him, he made a desperate move. The last thing he wanted was to be caught with his assets still tied to his name. In the dead of night, Langston's plane was prepped for takeoff. A private jet, on standby, was ready to fly him to a country where extradition wouldn't reach him. Prescott was already with him, making final arrangements. They were leaving, but they hadn't accounted for one thing. As the jet's engines roared to life, a single black SUV pulled up to the private runway, blocking the plane from taking off. Langston's heart raced. He stepped out of the plane, his face flushed with panic. What is this? The SUV doors opened, and Theodore Barrington stepped out, followed by Amelia. We thought you'd be leaving, Mr. Langston, Theodore said with a cold smile. But it seems you've forgotten something. Langston took a step back. What are you doing here? Amelia's voice was quiet, yet menacing. We're here to make sure you don't get away with it. A police convoy rounded the corner and pulled up behind the Barringtons' SUV. Dozens of officers poured out, surrounding Langston's plane. You're under arrest, Mr. Langston, Sergeant Miller announced, stepping forward. Langston's face went pale as he was handcuffed. You can't do this. You're making a huge mistake. Theodore stepped forward, his cane tapping softly on the ground. You made your own mistake, Langston, and now you're going to pay for it. Langston struggled, but the officers tightened their hold. Prescott tried to intervene, but he was quickly pushed aside. As Langston was loaded into the police vehicle, Theodore glanced at Amelia. We did it. Amelia smiled. We did more than that. We made sure that justice was served. The final chapter of the Barringtons' battle against Harold Langston had come to a close. The media erupted with stories of his arrest, his fortune seized, and his corrupt dealings exposed for the world to see. Judge Hanover, too, was under investigation, his career destroyed by the very greed he had allowed to fester. The Barringtons, though, didn't revel in victory. They had done what needed to be done. Nothing more, nothing less. They were lawyers, after all, and they had simply done their job. As they drove home that evening, the sun setting behind them, Theodore looked out the window and exhaled slowly. We've been through a lot, haven't we? Amelia chuckled softly. It's never easy, but it's always worth it. Theodore reached over and squeezed her hand. To justice, Amelia echoed, smiling. And with that, the Barringtons returned to their quiet life, knowing that the system they had fought so hard for had been restored, at least for now. The fight was over, but the impact they had made would ripple through the legal world for years to come.